A millionaire in a wheelchair lived in isolation, haunted by his past. But a determined little girl came along with a simple, powerful gesture. She held his hand. In her touch was a force stronger than doctors and medicine, and in the meeting of past and present, he found himself again. If you love great stories, please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're from. We continue. The Weight of Silence. Chapter 1. Shadows of Solitude. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across Lakeside Park's empty pathways as Walter Donovan maneuvered his wheelchair through the morning mist. At 72, he had mastered the art of solitude. 10 years in this chair had taught him how to navigate the physical world without assistance, but the landscape of his conscience remained an impassable terrain. The wheels of his custom titanium chair crunched over the gravel path that circled the lake. Even at this early hour, Walter was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair combed back with precision. Old habits from his corporate days were hard to break, even when there was no one to impress. The residents of Windcrest, Connecticut, had grown accustomed to the sight of the reclusive millionaire making his morning rounds through the park, his expression as distant as the horizon. Walter checked his Patek Philippe watch, 7:18 a.m. Perfect. Timing. The park would remain empty for at least another hour. These solitary moments were the only peace he found anymore, away from the suffocating silence of his Victorian mansion on Hillcrest Avenue. "Mr. Donovan, good morning." The cheerful greeting startled him. Walter turned to see Mrs. Peterson walking, her corgi approaching with that neighborly smile he'd come to dread. "Lovely day, isn't it? We missed you at the town council meeting yesterday. The Historical Society could really use your input on the library renovation." Walter offered a rehearsed smile. "Perhaps next time." She lingered, filling the air with pleasantries he barely registered. Walter nodded mechanically, his mind drifting to where it always went in moments of unwanted social interaction, back to that rainy evening 10 years ago. The screech of tires, the impact, the silence that followed. "Well, I'll let you enjoy your morning," Mrs. Peterson finally said, taking the hint from his vacant responses. "Do think about the library. Your architectural expertise would be invaluable." As she walked away, Walter exhaled. Once he had been the visionary behind Donovan Architectural Solutions, shaping skylines across America. His designs had transformed urban landscapes from Boston to Seattle. Now he couldn't bear to look at blueprints. They reminded him of plans, of futures, of possibilities, all the things he'd stolen from a child 1 decade ago. Walter pushed himself toward the eastern edge of the lake, where a small wooden dock extended over the water. It was his favorite spot, secluded by weeping willows. He positioned his wheelchair at the end of the dock and stared into the water. His reflection looked back, the hollow eyes of a man who had everything and nothing at the same time. His phone vibrated. Walter ignored it. Probably Lawrence, his financial advisor, with another investment opportunity or charitable cause seeking the Donovan fortune. Money, the one thing he had in abundance and the one thing utterly useless in buying what he truly needed, absolution. The morning light strengthened, burning away the mist. Walter closed his eyes, feeling the weak autumn sun on his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember the sensation of standing, of walking, of running, all distant memories from before the accident. The doctors had been clear. The spinal injury would keep him in that chair for life. No amount of surgeries, experimental treatments, or rehabilitation could restore function to his legs. He had tried everything in those first few years. The best specialists in the country, experimental procedures in Switzerland, alternative therapies in Arizona. Nothing worked. Eventually, Walter stopped trying. Perhaps this was his punishment, to remain imprisoned in a body that couldn't move forward, just as his mind remained trapped in that moment of impact. The vibration of his phone grew persistent. With a sigh, Walter pulled it from his pocket. Not Lawrence, but Helen, his housekeeper. "Yes," he answered, his voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Donovan, I'm sorry to disturb your morning, but Miss Sullivan from the Windcrest Chronicle is here. She's quite insistent about an interview for their series on local business pioneers. Walter's jaw tightened. I've declined 3 times already. She says she's willing to wait all day if necessary. Tell her I've left the country, he said, coldly. And Helen, no more unexpected visitors, that's what the gate is for. He ended the call before she could respond. The Chronicle's persistent interest in his story was becoming an annoyance. They wanted to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Donovan Architectural Solutions with a feature on its reclusive founder. What they didn't understand was that Walter Donovan, the visionary architect, had ceased to exist 10 years ago, just as surely as the child who had died because of his recklessness. Walter turned his chair and began the journey back toward the park entrance. The path curved around a children's playground, empty at this hour, swings moving, gently in the breeze. He usually avoided this section, taking the longer route around the north side of the lake. Today, something compelled him to wheel past the playground, past the swing set where small phantoms of memory sometimes played. The mansion awaited him, 26 rooms of polished hardwood and marble, filled with artwork worth millions, furniture, selected by the country's top designers, and not a single corner that felt like home. Walter had purchased it after the accident, after selling his penthouse in New York. He had wanted space, isolation, a fortress against the world's judgments. Now, it was merely an elaborate prison. His security system recognized his approach, opening the ornate iron gates automatically. The long curved driveway led to the 3-story Victorian structure, its facade an impressive display of 19th century craftsmanship restored with no expense spared. Walter had been drawn to its history, to the generations it had sheltered before him. Perhaps he had hoped some of its permanence would seep into his fractured existence. Helen met him at the side entrance, where the ramp had been installed. "Your breakfast is ready in the solarium," she said. "And I've rescheduled your physical therapy for tomorrow." Walter nodded, wheeling himself inside. He hadn't wanted the therapy sessions, but his doctor had insisted. "Maintaining muscle tone is essential, even without function," Dr. Winters had explained. "Otherwise, the atrophy will lead to further complications." So twice weekly, Aaron, the physical therapist, came to move Walter's useless legs through their exercises, bending and stretching limbs that felt like foreign appendages. Walter endured these sessions with stoic resignation, staring out the window while Aaron chatted about sports and weather. The solarium was bathed in morning light, the breakfast table set with the usual precision, fresh orange juice, steel cut, oatmeal with berries, whole grain toast and black coffee. Walter ate methodically, tasting nothing. Food had become mere fuel, necessity without pleasure. His iPad sat beside his plate, open to the Wall Street Journal. The Donovan Foundation's latest charitable contribution had made the business section $20 million to pediatric trauma research. The article praised the foundation's generous support, while noting the founder's continued absence from public life. These donations were Walter's attempt at atonement, carefully selected by Lawrence to create maximum impact in children's causes. Hospitals, schools, research facilities, all had benefited from Walter's guilt-driven philanthropy. But no amount of money could resurrect a child. No charity could erase the image burned into his memory. A small body on rain-slicked asphalt, utterly still in the glow of headlights. After breakfast, Walter retreated to his study. The room was lined with architectural books and awards he no longer looked at. A scale model of his most famous design, the Griffin Tower in Chicago, sat gathering dust on a side table. He wheeled himself to the window overlooking the grounds, where a gardener was raking leaves into neat piles. The day stretched before him, identical to the one before and the one to follow. Hours to fill with meaningless activities, reading books he'd forget, watching documentaries that failed to engage him, perhaps reviewing foundation proposals that Lawrence would handle anyway. This was his life now, a hollow routine performed, in luxurious surroundings, marking time until what? Walter rarely allowed himself to complete that thought. The gardener finished with the leaves and moved toward the gate. Walter watched him go, this man who walked with ease, who would return to a modest home somewhere in town, perhaps to children who would run to greet him. A life simple, but complete. Walter turned away from the window. The weight of another day settled onto his shoulders as he reached for a book he had no interest in reading. Tomorrow he would return to the park, follow the same path, sit by the same lake. The wheels of his chair would trace the same circles, just as his thoughts traveled, their well-worn path of regret. Nothing would change. Nothing could change. Or so Walter Donovan believed on this ordinary autumn morning, unaware that tomorrow would bring an encounter that would shatter the carefully constructed prison of his existence. The weight of silence. Chapter 9. To an unexpected encounter. The following morning arrived with a dense fog that blanketed Windcrest, transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and otherworldly. Walter wheeled himself through the park entrance, the mist swirling around his chair like spectral companions. The weather had deterred the usual morning walkers, leaving the paths deserted, just as he preferred. His wheels left twin trails in the light dew covering the gravel. The silence was complete, broken only by distant birdsong and the soft mechanical purr of his chair. Walter breathed deeply, tasting the dampness in the air. Days like this, when the world seemed wrapped in cotton, provided a brief respite from the sharp edges of his existence. He followed his usual route toward the dock, passing the empty playground without allowing his eyes to linger. The lake appeared and disappeared through veils of fog, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the diffused grey light. Walter slowed as he approached his customary spot, noticing with irritation that someone was already there, a small figure standing at the end of the dock. He considered turning back, unwilling to share his sanctuary. But something about the solitary silhouette gave him pause. It was a child, a girl perhaps 10 or 11 years old, staring out at the water with unusual stillness. Walter remained at the edge of the trees, watching. Children rarely ventured into this secluded corner of the park, especially alone at this early hour. She wore a yellow raincoat despite the absence of rain, the bright color stark against the monochrome backdrop. Her dark hair hung in two neat braids. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Walter instinctively backed his chair slightly, uncomfortable at being caught observing her. The girl showed no surprise at the sight of him. Instead, she smiled, a calm, measured expression that seemed strangely mature for her years. "Good morning," she called, her voice clear in the still air. Walter nodded stiffly, uncertain how to proceed. Social niceties had become foreign to him over the years of isolation. "Would you like to sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the dock. "I can move." "No need," Walter replied, his voice rough. "I'll find another spot." He began to turn his chair, but her next words stopped him. "You come here every day, don't you? I've seen you before." Walter looked back at her, frowning. "Do you live nearby?" "Not too far." She walked toward him with unhurried steps. "My name's Emma. Emma Gray." She extended a small hand with the confidence of someone much older. Walter hesitated before briefly shaking it, uncomfortable with the contact. "Walter Donovan," he offered, then immediately wondered why he'd given his name. "I know," Emma replied simply. "Everyone knows who you are." Walter's discomfort deepened. He had spent years cultivating anonymity in Windcrest, despite the impossibility of true invisibility for someone of his wealth and past prominence. "You designed that big glass building in New York, right? The one that looks like it's made of water when the sun hits it." "The Meridian," Walter said, surprised by her knowledge. "That was a long time ago." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "My teacher showed us pictures in art class. She said it changed how people think about architecture." Walter felt the familiar ache that accompanied any mention of his former work. "Your teacher exaggerates." "I don't think so." Emma moved to the side of the dock, allowing space for his wheelchair. "It's really beautiful, like it's alive somehow." Despite his discomfort, Walter found himself wheeling onto the dock beside her. Something about the girl's directness bypassed his usual defenses. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the fog drift across the water. Walter stole glances at his unexpected companion. Up close, he could see her clothes were well worn but clean, the yellow raincoat slightly too large, perhaps handed down from an older sibling. Her face had a serious quality, with observant brown eyes that seemed to absorb everything. "Aren't you supposed to be in school?" he finally asked. "It's Teacher Development Day," Emma replied. "No classes." "And your parents allow you to wander the park alone?" A shadow crossed her face. "My mom has to work. She's a nurse at Windcrest Memorial, double shifts this week." Walter nodded, not pursuing the topic further. The girl's circumstances were none of his business. Still, he found himself wondering about the absent father, the working mother, the life that had produced this unusually self-possessed child. "I should go," he said, suddenly eager to return to his solitude. "Can I ask you something first, Mr. Donovan?" Walter sighed. "What is it?" Emma turned to face him fully, her expression solemn. "Why don't you ever try to stand up?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Walter stared at her, anger rising in his chest. "That's not an appropriate question," he said coldly. "I'm sorry," she replied, though she didn't look particularly contrite. "It's just, I wondered if you've tried." "Recently?" Walter's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. "Young lady, I've been paralyzed for 10 years. My condition is permanent." Emma considered this. "But sometimes doctors are wrong. Not about this." Walter began to turn his chair. "Goodbye, Miss Gray." "My aunt was in a wheelchair too," Emma called after him. "Everyone said she'd never walk again, but she did." Walter paused, then slowly turned back. "That was a different situation entirely, I'm sure." "Maybe." Emma approached his chair with that same unhurried confidence. "But she said the hardest part wasn't physical, it was believing she could." Walter felt a mix of irritation and unwilling fascination. "And how old are you exactly?" 11.5. "Well, Emma Gray, 11.5, I appreciate your optimism, but some realities can't be overcome with positive thinking." She tilted her head slightly. "Have you tried lately, though?" Walter was about to deliver a sharp rebuke when something in her gaze stopped him. There was no pity there, no childish naivety, only a steady belief that was somehow more disarming than either. "No," he admitted. "Not in many years." Emma nodded as if confirming a suspicion. Then, with the directness that seemed to characterize her, she extended her hand. "Take my hand and stand up." Walter almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "That's not possible." "How? Do you know if you haven't tried?" Emma's hand remained outstretched, unwavering. "I know because I've consulted with the finest medical specialists in the world. I know because I've undergone every treatment available. I know because my spinal cord was irreparably damaged." "Just try," she insisted softly. "What's the worst that could happen?" Walter stared at her small hand. The worst that could happen, he thought bitterly, was the humiliation of failure, the cruel rekindling of hope only to have it extinguished again. But something about the girl's certainty made refusal difficult. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but found himself reaching for her hand nonetheless. Her fingers were warm and surprisingly strong as they closed around his. Walter placed his other hand on the armrest of his wheelchair, preparing for the inevitable nothing. "Now stand," Emma said, her voice calm and sure. Walter exhaled sharply. "I can't." "Try." Perhaps it was the simplicity of her command, or the sheer unexpectedness of this entire encounter, but Walter found himself attempting to rise. He exerted pressure downward through his hands, expecting the usual void of sensation below his waist. Then he felt it, a faint tingling in his thighs, so subtle he thought he'd imagined it. A phantom sensation, he told himself, the kind that occasionally tormented those with spinal injuries. But as Emma tightened her grip, the tingling intensified, spreading downward. Walter gasped, his eyes widening in shock. "What is it?" Emma asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "Nothing," Walter said quickly, releasing her hand. The sensation immediately faded. "A muscle spasm. It happens occasionally." Emma smiled, that same knowing smile that seemed to belong to someone much older. "It wasn't nothing, Mr. Donovan." Walter's heart raced. He'd experienced phantom sensations before, but this had felt different, more localized, more real. But that was impossible. He forced his breathing to steady. "It's time for you to go home, Emma. Your mother will be worried." "She's still at work," Emma replied. "I'll come back tomorrow, same time." "I don't think—" "I'll be here," she interrupted with quiet certainty. "And we can try again." Before Walter could protest further, Emma turned and walked away, her yellow raincoat bright against the mist. He watched her disappear among the trees, an inexplicable sense of loss washing over him as she vanished from sight. For several minutes, Walter sat motionless on the dock, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The rational part of him dismissed the sensation as a coincidence, a quirk of his damaged nervous system. Yet another part, a part he'd thought long dead, whispered of possibilities. He placed his hands on his thighs, willing the feeling to return. Nothing. Whatever had happened when he touched Emma's hand remained elusive. The fog began to lift, revealing the lake in patches of silver. Walter's watch showed 8:32 a.m., far later than he usually stayed at the park. With a deep breath, he turned his chair and headed back along the path. As he approached the playground, Walter slowed. The empty swings moved gently in the breeze, stirring a memory. The child from the accident, had he been Emma's age? Walter realized with a pang that he'd never known. After the police reports and the settlement, he'd deliberately avoided learning anything personal about the victim. It had been easier that way to think of it as an incident rather than the ending of a young life. Back at the mansion, Walter declined breakfast, retreating instead to his room. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the morning's encounter. Who was this child who spoke with such conviction? And what had caused that momentary sensation in his legs? Walter closed his eyes, recalling Emma's words. "Take my hand and stand up." Such a simple command, delivered with absolute certainty. For the first time in years, a crack appeared in the solid wall of Walter's resignation. A dangerous crack, he knew. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford, not after everything. Yet as he drifted into an unexpected sleep, Walter found himself dreaming of standing on the dock, the fog clearing around him, and a small hand in his own guiding him forward into the light, the weight of silence. Chapter 3. Small Steps. Walter spent a restless night, his dreams filled with sensations of walking, running, falling. He woke before dawn, perspiration beading his forehead, the phantom feeling of movement still tingling in his legs. For several minutes he lay perfectly still, afraid to disrupt whatever fragile connection might have been re-established between his mind and his lower limbs. Finally he reached down and pinched his thigh. Nothing. No pain, no pressure, just the same void of sensation that had been his reality for a decade. Walter exhaled slowly, disappointed despite his determination not to hope. As his bedside clock showed 6:30 a.m., he faced a decision. His usual morning routine would take him to the park within the hour where Emma had promised to meet him. The rational choice was to avoid the encounter entirely, to visit another part of town perhaps, or remain home altogether. Nothing good could come from indulging a child's magical thinking, or worse, his own desperate wish for a miracle. Yet at 7:15, Walter found himself wheeling through the park entrance, his heart beating unusually fast. The morning was clear, the previous day's fog replaced by crystalline autumn sunlight that sparkled on the lake. Walter followed his familiar path, telling himself he was merely maintaining his routine, that if the grey girl appeared again, he would politely but firmly end their acquaintance. Emma was already at the dock, sitting with her legs dangling over the edge, throwing small pebbles into the water. Today she wore a blue sweater over jeans, her dark hair tied back in a single braid. She turned at the sound of his approaching wheelchair and smiled as if his arrival was a certainty. "Good morning, Mr. Donovan." Walter nodded stiffly. "Miss Gray." "I knew you'd come." She stood, dusting off her jeans. "I come here every day," Walter replied. "It has nothing to do with you." Emma's smile didn't falter. "Did you feel it yesterday, when you tried to stand?" Walter positioned his chair at the end of the dock before answering. "What I felt was a common neurological phenomenon. Phantom sensations are well documented in cases like mine." But you did feel something. Walter sighed. Emma, I appreciate your interest in my condition, but I've had 10 years to accept my situation. False hope isn't helpful. Emma considered this, her head tilted slightly. What if it's not false? I've consulted with specialists at Johns Hopkins Mayo Clinic and hospitals across Europe. The damage to my spinal cord is permanent. My mum says doctors don't know everything. Walter raised an eyebrow. Your mother is a nurse, correct? She should have more respect for medical expertise. She does, Emma replied. But she also believes in things science can't explain yet. She moved closer to his chair. Can we try again today? Walter should have refused, he knew that. Yet something in the girl's unwavering confidence made him hesitate. What harm could there be in humoring her once more? Then he could end this strange interlude with clear conscience. Once more, he conceded, but then we put this matter to rest. Emma nodded solemnly. Deal. She extended both hands this time. Walter hesitated before placing his palms against hers, noting how small her hands were compared to his own. Now close your eyes, Emma instructed. That wasn't part of yesterday's protocol, Walter observed dryly. Please? With a sigh, Walter closed his eyes. Think about standing up, Emma's voice came softly. Remember how it feels. The pressure on your feet, the balance in your legs, the straightening of your spine. Walter found himself following her instructions, summoning memories from before the accident. The simple act of standing, something he'd once done without thought, thousands of times a day. Now try, Emma whispered. Walter tightened his grip on her hands and attempted to rise, bracing himself for disappointment. The tingling began immediately, stronger than yesterday, unmistakable. It spread from his hips downward, a rush of pins and needles followed by a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. Walter gasped, his eyes flying open. You feel it again, Emma said. It wasn't a question. Walter couldn't speak. The sensation continued, flooding through his long dormant nerves. He tried to flex his thigh muscles and felt, or imagined he felt, a faint response. Keep trying, Emma encouraged, her grip firm. Walter exerted pressure downward, attempting to shift some of his weight to his feet. For an instant, so brief he might have imagined it, he felt his right foot press against the dock's wooden planks. Then the connection was gone. The sensation receded, like a wave pulling back from shore, leaving numbness in its wake. Walter slumped in his chair, breathing heavily. That was better than yesterday, Emma said, still holding his hands. Walter stared at her, confusion and fragile hope warring in his chest. This isn't possible. It's happening anyway, she replied, simply. Then, with a slight smile, same time tomorrow? Before he could answer, Emma released his hands and stepped back. I have to go now. Mum's making pancakes before her shift. Walter watched her walk away, his mind reeling. When she reached the trees, Emma turned and waved. He raised his hand automatically in response, still too stunned to speak. After she disappeared, Walter remained on the dock, attempting to recapture the sensation in his legs. Nothing happened. Whatever connection had briefly flickered to life was dormant again, leaving him with only the memory of what he'd felt and a dangerous spark of hope. Back at the mansion, Walter cancelled his morning appointments and sequestered himself in his study. He pulled up his medical records on his computer, files he hadn't looked at in years, detailed scans and reports that all reached the same conclusion: permanent damage to the T10-T12 vertebrae, resulting in complete paraplegia with no hope of recovery. Walter stared at the images of his damaged spine, the clinical language describing his condition. The rational part of his mind insisted that what had happened at the dock was impossible, a cruel trick of his desperate subconscious. Yet he couldn't deny what he'd felt. On impulse, Walter wheeled himself to the rarely used home gym. The space was immaculate, maintained by his staff despite his lack of interest in physical fitness beyond the basic exercises prescribed by his doctors. In the corner stood parallel bars, installed years ago during his initial futile attempts at rehabilitation. Walter positioned his wheelchair at one end of the bars and engaged the brakes. Gripping the rails, he attempted to recreate the sensation he'd experienced with Emma. He concentrated, willing his legs to respond, to feel, to move. Nothing happened. After several frustrated attempts, Walter released the bars, a bitter taste, in his mouth. Whatever had occurred with Emma wasn't something he could replicate alone. That evening, Walter found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, researching. He spent hours online, reading accounts of unexpected recoveries, from spinal injuries, cases where patients regained function years after being told they never would. Most were explained by incomplete injuries misdiagnosed as complete, or by experimental treatments finally yielding results. None of the stories mentioned 11-year-old girls with calm eyes and absolute conviction. The next morning, Walter arrived at the park earlier than usual, a nervous energy driving him. Emma wasn't at the dock yet. He waited, watching the mist rise from the lake as the sun climbed higher. By 8 o'clock, doubt began to gnaw at him. Had she lost interest in their strange experiment? Had her mother forbidden her from speaking to the reclusive millionaire? Just as Walter was about to leave, Emma appeared on the path, slightly out of breath. "Sorry, I'm late," she called. "Mom needed help with something." Relief washed over Walter, followed immediately by self-consciousness. He shouldn't care whether this child kept their appointment. He shouldn't be investing any emotional energy in these impossible moments of sensation. Yet here he was, heart lightening at the sight of her. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he admitted, as she reached the dock. "I promised, didn't I?" Emma settled beside his chair. "Did you practice yesterday?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "Practice what exactly?" "Trying to feel your legs, remembering how to stand." He almost lied, then found himself unwilling to do so. "Yes, nothing happened." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe it only works when we try together." "Emma," Walter said carefully, "I need to understand what you think is happening here. Do you believe you have some sort of healing ability?" She considered the question seriously. "I don't know, I just knew I needed to help you." "Why me?" Emma shrugged. "I saw you here every morning, always alone. You looked stuck." The simple observation struck Walter deeply. Stuck. Yes, that was precisely what he'd been for 10 years. Physically, emotionally, spiritually stuck in the moment of that accident. "Shall we try again?" Emma extended her hands. This time Walter took them without hesitation. He closed his eyes automatically, focusing on the sensation of Emma's small, warm hands in his. The tingling began more quickly today, spreading through his hips and down his thighs. Walter concentrated, trying to channel the energy to direct it toward movement. His right foot twitched. It was slight, barely perceptible, but unmistakably real. Walter's eyes flew open, meeting Emma's steady gaze. "I felt that," she said quietly. "Keep going." Walter tightened his grip on her hands and focused on his left foot. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then slowly his toes curled downward. A sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. It had been 10 years since he'd voluntarily moved any part of his lower body. The reality of it overwhelmed him. "That's it," Emma encouraged. "Keep remembering how it feels." Walter closed his eyes again, concentrating on the sensation flowing through his legs. The movement remained minimal, twitches and small flexes rather than any weight-bearing motion, but it was undeniably real. When Emma finally released his hands, the connection didn't disappear immediately as it had before. Walter could still feel a faint tingling in his feet for several seconds before the numbness returned. "It's lasting longer," Emma observed. Walter nodded, unable to speak. His mind raced with implications, possibilities, questions. "Tomorrow we'll try standing," Emma said with calm certainty. Walter shook his head. "Emma, this is extraordinary, but we need to be realistic. Whatever is happening, it's not a complete recovery. Small movements are a far cry from standing or walking." We have to start somewhere. Emma stood, brushing off her jeans. Small steps first, right? The phrase struck Walter with unexpected force. Small steps. How long had it been since he'd thought in terms of progress rather than stasis? I should speak with your mother, he said suddenly. She should know about whatever this is. A shadow crossed Emma's face. Not yet, please. Mom has enough to worry about. But just a few more days, Emma insisted, until we know for sure it's really happening. Walter frowned. Emma, I can't in good conscience continue this without your mother's knowledge. She works double shifts all week, Emma replied. Please, Mr. Donovan, just until Sunday. Against his better judgment, Walter found himself nodding. Until Sunday. Then we talk to your mother. Emma smiled, relief evident in her expression. Thank you. See you tomorrow. As she walked away, Walter called after her. Emma, how do you get to the park each morning? Does someone bring you? She turned, walking backward for a few steps. I take the bus. It's only 2 stops. The information troubled Walter. An 11-year-old girl traveling alone each morning to meet a virtual stranger. What would her mother think? What would anyone think of their arrangement? Yet as Walter wheeled himself back along the path, he couldn't deny the reality of what had happened. His legs had moved. After 10 years of immobility, his feet had responded to his commands. It was medically impossible, yet it had happened. Back. At the mansion, Walter wheeled past Helen without his usual morning greeting, heading straight for the home gym. At the parallel bars, he positioned his chair and engaged the brakes. Gripping the rails, he closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to recapture the sensation he'd experienced with Emma. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as he was about to give up, Walter felt it, a faint tingling in his right foot. Focusing intently, he managed to curl his toes slightly, the movement barely visible but definitely present. Walter stared down at his foot in amazement. Whatever connection Emma had re-established continued to function, however weakly, even in her absence. For the first time in 10 years, Walter Donovan felt something he'd thought forever lost. Possibility. The weight of silence. Chapter 4. The Yay. Revelation. For the next 3 days, Walter and Emma met at the dock each morning. Their routine became familiar. Emma would take his hands, Walter would close his eyes, and together they would focus on reawakening his dormant nerves. Each session lasted longer than the one before, with incremental improvements that defied medical explanation. By Friday, Walter could wiggle his toes and flex his ankles without Emma's physical contact, though the movements were stronger when they were connected. On Saturday, he managed to lift his right leg slightly off the footrest of his wheelchair, a motion that left him breathless with exhilaration and exhaustion. Tomorrow we try standing, Emma declared after that session, her confidence unwavering. Walter had learned not to doubt her. Whatever was happening between them transcended his understanding, but he couldn't deny the results. He spent hours in his home gym between their meetings, practicing the small movements, building strength and control. He'd also begun to learn more about Emma during their daily conversations. She lived with her mother in a small apartment near Windcrest Memorial Hospital. She loved science fiction books and had a talent for mathematics. Her favorite subject was astronomy. She could name constellations and explain planetary movements with impressive detail. Yet for all her openness about certain topics, Emma remained strangely reticent about others. She never mentioned her father. She changed the subject whenever Walter asked about her family beyond her mother. And she continued to insist that they keep their meetings private until Sunday. Tomorrow you'll meet my mum, she said on Saturday. She has the day off. Walter nodded, a strange nervousness settling in his stomach. What would he tell Sarah Gray? How could he explain what was happening without sounding delusional? The medical impossibility of his improving condition wasn't lost on him. No reputable doctor would believe that an 11-year-old girl had somehow initiated recovery from a complete spinal cord injury through mere touch and conviction. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Walter's legs were responding. Minimally, yes, but responding nonetheless. Sunday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity, the sky a deep October blue. Walter dressed with unusual care, selecting a casual but expensive sweater rather than his usual suit. He found himself checking his appearance in the mirror, something he rarely bothered with anymore, and was startled by what he saw. The perpetual grimness that had marked his features for a decade had softened. There was color in his face, a brightness in his eyes that had been absent for years. He looked alive. As Walter wheeled himself toward the park, he rehearsed what he would say to Emma's mother. He would be measured, rational, emphasizing the small nature of his improvements while acknowledging their significance. He would offer to consult with specialists to document what was happening. He would assure her that his intentions toward Emma were entirely appropriate, that he saw her as a remarkable child who had somehow catalyzed a medical miracle. Emma was waiting at their usual spot, but something was different. She stood alone at the end of the dock, her posture rigid, hands clasped tightly before her. She wore a dress today, simple blue cotton with a white cardigan, as if for a special occasion. "Good morning," Walter called as he approached. "Is your mother joining us?" Emma turned, and Walter was startled to see tears in her eyes. She wiped them quickly with the back of her hand. "She's coming," Emma said, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "She'll be here soon." Walter wheeled closer, concern rising. "Emma, what's wrong?" She looked at him directly, her young face solemn. "There's something I need to tell you first, before she gets here." A chill ran through Walter, though he couldn't have explained why. "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath. "It's about why I came to find you." "I thought it was coincidence," Walter said slowly. "You said you saw me here every morning." "I did. But it wasn't." Emma struggled for words. "It wasn't random." Walter waited, suddenly certain he didn't want to hear what would come next. "Mr. Donovan, do you remember the accident, the one that put you in the wheelchair?" The question hit Walter like a physical blow. Of course he remembered. Every detail was seared into his consciousness. The rain-slicked road, the small figure darting out between parked cars, the screech of brakes applied too late. "Yes," he managed, his mouth dry. Emma's eyes never left his. "The boy who was hurt in that accident. His name was Daniel." Walter felt the world tilt beneath him. In 10 years, he had never spoken the child's name aloud, had deliberately avoided learning personal details beyond what was necessary for the settlement. It had been easier that way to think of the victim, rather than a boy with a name, a family, a future. "Daniel Gray," Emma continued softly. "He was my brother." The words hung in the air between them. Impossible, devastating. Walter stared at Emma, seeing her anew, the serious eyes, the quiet dignity, the calm certainty that had seemed so out of place in a child her age. Qualities formed, perhaps, by unimaginable loss. "No," Walter whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." But even as he denied it, connections formed in his mind. The timing would be right. The accident had been 10 years ago. Emma would have been barely more than a toddler, a family he had compensated financially, but never faced personally. "Mom will explain." "Everything," Emma said. "She's the one who told me about you, about what happened." Walter felt physically ill, bile rising in his throat. For days he had held this child's hands, accepted her help, even begun to care for her, all while remaining ignorant of the horrific connection between them. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why would you help me, after what I did?" Emma's answer was simple and devastating. Because Daniel would have wanted it. Walter's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, knuckles white. The brief joy of his physical progress evaporated, replaced by crushing guilt. Every sensation, every movement in his legs now felt like theft, something he'd taken from a family he'd already damaged beyond repair. "I should go," he said hoarsely, beginning to turn his chair. "Please don't," Emma said, reaching for his arm. "Mom wants to meet you. She knows about what's been happening with your legs." Walter shook his head. "I can't face her, not like this." "Mr. Donovan." The new voice came from behind him. Walter froze, then slowly turned his chair. A woman stood on the path leading to the dock. She was perhaps 40, with the same dark hair as Emma, though hers was streaked with premature grey. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, a hospital ID badge still clipped to her belt. Her face showed the subtle marks of chronic exhaustion, but her eyes, so like Emma's, were clear and direct. "Mrs. Gray," Walter said, his voice barely audible. "Sarah, please." She approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time." Walter couldn't speak. The nightmare scenario he'd avoided for a decade was unfolding before him, facing the mother of the child whose life he'd taken through his recklessness. No financial settlement, no matter how generous, could compensate for such a loss. Sarah Gray stopped a few feet from his chair. There was no hatred in her expression, no accusation, only a profound weariness and something else Walter couldn't identify. "Emma has told me about your meetings," she said, "about what's been happening." Walter found his voice. "Mrs. Gray, Sarah, I had no idea who Emma was. If I had known—" "You would have avoided her," Sarah finished for him, "the way you've avoided facing us for 10 years. The truth of it silenced him. "Mom," Emma said softly, moving to her mother's side, "he can move his legs now. A little bit." Sarah nodded. "I know, sweetheart." She looked back at Walter. "May I sit with you for a moment? There are things I need to say." Walter gestured wordlessly to the bench beside the dock. Sarah sat, while Emma remained standing, her hand on her mother's shoulder. "After the accident," Sarah began, "after we lost Daniel, I was consumed by anger. At you, at the world, at God, at everything. The settlement money meant nothing. It gathered dust in an account while I worked double shifts to keep my mind occupied, to exhaustion myself enough to sleep without nightmares." Walter bowed his head, accepting the words he deserved to hear. "Then, about 3 years ago, I had a patient, a young man paralyzed in a motorcycle accident. He was so angry, so bitter about what had happened to him. It reminded me of my own anger, how it had poisoned everything." Sarah's voice softened. "That's when I started to research you, to learn what had happened after the accident. I discovered you were also wheelchair-bound, living as a recluse." Walter looked up, surprised. "You knew?" Sarah nodded. "The lawyers advised us not to have any contact with you, but I needed to understand. I learned about your injury, your withdrawal from public life. I recognized the prison you'd built for yourself, because I'd built one too." Emma moved closer to her mother, their resemblance striking in the morning light. "Last year, Emma found an old photo album with pictures of Daniel. She started asking questions about him, about what happened. I told her everything, including about you." Walter's gaze shifted to Emma, who met his eyes without flinching. "It was Emma's idea to find you," Sarah continued. "I objected at first, but she was determined. I saw you in the park from the bus window," Emma explained. "Mom pointed you out once when we drove past. I started taking the bus there in the mornings, watching you from a distance." "But why?" Walter asked, still struggling to comprehend. "Why would you want to help me, of all people?" It was Sarah who answered, her voice steady. "Because holding on to hatred was destroying us, just as your guilt was destroying you." Emma understood that somehow, even at her age, "I just knew I needed to help you," Emma said simply, "to help you walk again." Walter shook his head, overwhelmed. "What's happening with my legs? It's medically impossible. I don't understand it." "Neither do I," Sarah admitted. "I'm a nurse. I know the prognosis for complete spinal injuries, but I also know that sometimes things happen that medicine can't explain." Walter looked at Emma, this extraordinary child who had every reason to hate him, but had instead extended her hand in healing. "You should despise me," he said softly. "Sometimes I did," Emma replied with startling honesty, "when I first learned what happened to Daniel. But then I had a dream about him. He was telling me to help you." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "Emma has always had intuitions, moments of knowing things she shouldn't know even before the accident." Walter struggled to process everything he was hearing. The rational part of him rejected talk of dreams and intuitions. Yet he couldn't deny what had happened to his legs since meeting Emma. "I don't deserve this," he said finally. "Any of it. Your forgiveness, Emma's help, this chance at recovery." "Perhaps not," Sarah agreed, her directness reminiscent of her daughter's. "But deserving has nothing to do with it. This isn't about you, Mr. Donovan. It's about us, about Emma and me finding a way forward." Walter nodded slowly, beginning to understand. Their forgiveness wasn't a gift to him. It was a necessity for them, a way to reclaim their lives from the shadow of tragedy. "What happens now?" he asked. "That depends," Sarah replied. "Do you want to continue working with Emma, to see how far this recovery might go?" Walter looked. Fat Emma, standing tall beside her mother, her expression serene. The revelation of her identity should have tainted their connection, made it impossible to continue. Yet instead it had transformed it into something deeper, more profound. "Yes," he said finally, "if you're both willing." Emma smiled, a genuine expression that lightened her serious face. "We're not done yet, Mr. Donovan. Not even close." "Then let's see where this leads," Sarah said, standing. "But from now on these sessions happen at your home with me present. No more secret meetings in the park." "Of course," Walter agreed immediately. "And one more thing," Sarah added, her voice firming. "This arrangement remains private. No media, no doctors or researchers until we decide otherwise. Emma's welfare comes first." Walter nodded. "I understand." Sarah extended her hand, the same gesture her daughter had made days earlier on this very dock. "Then we have an agreement." As Walter shook her hand, he felt something shift inside him. Not the physical sensation that Emma's touch evoked, but something equally profound. For 10 years he had been paralyzed not just physically but emotionally, frozen in the moment of the accident. Now, against all odds, he had been offered a path forward by the very people he had hurt most deeply. "Shall we try again today?" Emma asked, moving to stand beside his wheelchair. "Show Mum what we've been doing." Walter looked up at Sarah, seeking permission. She nodded. "Yes," he said, turning back to Emma. "Let's show her." Emma took his hands in hers, their touch, now familiar. "Close your eyes and remember," she instructed as she had each day before. Walter obeyed, aware of Sarah watching intently. The tingling began, flowing through his hips and down his legs, stronger today than ever before. He focused on his right foot, lifting it slightly off the footrest. "Good," Emma encouraged. "Now the left one." With concentrated effort, Walter raised his left foot as well. He heard Sarah's soft gasp. "Now," Emma said, her voice steady with conviction, "we're going to try standing." "Just for a moment." Walter's eyes flew open. "Emma, I don't think—" "You can," she interrupted. "I know you can." Sarah moved forward, as if to object, then stopped herself. The trust she placed in her daughter was evident in her restraint. "I'll help," Emma said, positioning herself directly in front of Walter's chair. "Mum, stand on his other side, please." Sarah complied, moving beside the wheelchair. Walter engaged the brakes, his heart racing with equal parts fear and anticipation. "Take my hands," Emma instructed, "and when you're ready, try to push yourself up." Walter gripped Emma's small hands tightly, then placed his feet firmly on the ground. The sensation was strange, pressure against his soles that he could actually feel. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly despite the concern in her eyes. "Ready?" Emma asked. Walter took a deep breath. "Ready." He tightened his grip on Emma's hands and pushed downward with his feet, simultaneously pulling upward with his arms. For a moment nothing happened, then slowly he began to rise. His legs trembled violently with the effort, unused muscles straining after years of atrophy. The movement was minimal. He raised himself perhaps 2 inches from the seat, but it was undeniably real. For 3 seconds, Walter Donovan stood, supported by Emma's unwavering grip and his own quaking legs. Then, exhausted by the effort, he sank back into his chair. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Emma beamed, her face alight with triumph. "You did it," she whispered. "You stood up." Walter couldn't speak. the physical achievement, was overwhelming enough, but the context, standing with the support of the family whose lives he had shattered, rendered him speechless. In that moment, on a sunlit dock beside a peaceful lake, Walter understood that what was happening transcended physical healing. Whatever inexplicable gift Emma possessed had not only reconnected his mind to his limbs, but was offering a chance to reconnect his soul to humanity. And as he looked from daughter to mother, both regarding him not with hatred, but with something approaching compassion, Walter Donovan faced a truth he had been running from for a decade. The hardest step would not be learning to walk again, but learning to forgive himself. The Weight of Silence. Chapter 5. The Path to Redemption, the Autumn. Weeks unfolded in a new rhythm for Walter. 3 times weekly, Sarah would bring Emma to the mansion after school. They converted the home gym into a rehabilitation space, with Emma's unwavering belief serving as the most powerful therapy Walter had ever experienced. Progress came in small increments. Standing for 5 seconds became 10, then 30. Walter learned to shift his weight from one trembling leg to another. Each achievement was marked by Emma's quiet pride and Sarah's careful documentation in a journal she kept. "We should consider bringing in a physical therapist," Sarah suggested one evening in late October, as she watched Walter struggle through another standing session. "Someone who specializes in spinal recovery." Walter lowered himself back into his wheelchair, exhausted but exhilarated by the day's progress. "I thought we agreed to keep this private." "We can find someone discreet," Sarah replied. "Someone who would sign a confidentiality agreement. Your muscles need professional attention if you're going to build the strength necessary for walking." Walter glanced at Emma, who was arranging equipment for their next exercise. Over the weeks, he'd come to rely on her judgment almost as much as her inexplicable healing presence. "What do you think, Emma?" he asked. She considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "I think Mom's right. We need help now." Walter nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls tomorrow." As Sarah gathered their belongings, Walter wheeled himself to the window overlooking the grounds. The trees blazed with autumn colors, red and gold against the darkening sky. For years, he had looked at this view without truly seeing it. The beauty of the world rendered meaningless by his guilt. Now he found himself noticing details: the particular quality of late afternoon light, the graceful movement of branches in the wind, the last roses still blooming in the garden below. "Same time on Thursday?" Sarah asked, breaking into his thoughts. "Actually," Walter turned from the window, "I was wondering if you both might join me for dinner before our session. Helen is an excellent cook and I—" He hesitated, unfamiliar with the vulnerability of social invitations after years of isolation. "I would enjoy the company." Sarah and Emma exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. It was Sarah who answered. "We'd like that, wouldn't we, Emma?" Emma nodded, a small smile lighting her solemn face. "Yes, thank you." "Mr. Donovan." "Walter," he corrected gently. "I think, after all this, you can call me Walter." The dinner that Thursday marked a turning point. Helen, surprised but pleased by the rare appearance of guests, prepared a meal that transformed the formal dining room into a place of warmth and conversation. Walter found himself sharing stories of his architectural projects, describing the inspiration behind buildings that had once been his passion. Emma listened with rapt attention, asking questions that revealed her deep interest in how things were made, how spaces could affect the people who inhabited them. Sarah spoke of her work at the hospital, the challenges and rewards of nursing. Walter noticed how she skillfully avoided mentioning the financial struggles that must accompany raising a child alone on a nurse's salary. He made a mental note to address this, to find a way to help that she might accept. As weeks passed, these dinners became a regular occurrence. The formal dining room gave way to the more comfortable kitchen, where they would gather around the island as Helen prepared meals they all participated in. Walter discovered Emma's love of baking, Sarah's talent for storytelling, the small domestic pleasures he had denied himself for a decade. Meanwhile, His physical progress continued under the guidance of Dr. Abernathy, a rehabilitation specialist who had signed an extensive confidentiality agreement. The doctor's initial skepticism had given way to cautious amazement as he documented Walter's improving condition. "I have never seen anything like it," he admitted during one session. "By all medical standards, your injury should be permanent. Yet here you are regaining function. If I hadn't seen it myself, I wouldn't believe it." What Dr. Abernathy couldn't measure was the emotional healing that paralleled Walter's physical recovery. The burden of guilt he'd carried for 10 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. In its place grew something new, a sense of responsibility that looked forward rather than backward, that sought to create rather than atone. This shift manifested in unexpected ways. Walter began reviewing the Donovan Foundation's charitable activities, redirecting funds toward programs that directly benefited children in need. He reached out to former colleagues in architecture, offering to mentor young designers interested in accessible building projects. He even began sketching again, simple drawings at first, then more complex designs that incorporated his new understanding of mobility challenges. One evening in early November, as Walter worked on a sketch at his desk, Sarah entered his study, alone. Emma was in the kitchen with Helen learning to make apple pie. "May I?" Sarah gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Walter nodded, setting aside his drawing. He'd grown comfortable in Sarah's presence, but there remained a certain tension, unspoken questions that hovered between them, especially when Emma wasn't present as a buffer. Sarah settled into the chair, her nurse's scrubs replaced by casual jeans and a sweater. She looked tired after her shift, but there was a purposefulness in her expression that Walter had come to recognize. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she began, "about the settlement." Walter tensed slightly. The financial agreement, reached after Daniel's accident, had been substantial, over $8 million, an amount his lawyers had assured him was more than generous. He'd never known what the Gray family had done with the money, had deliberately avoided learning how they'd moved forward after the tragedy. "What about it?" he asked carefully. Sarah met his gaze directly. "I want you to know that most of it remains untouched, in a trust for Emma's education and a foundation in Daniel's name." This surprised Walter. Given their modest apartment and Sarah's continued long hours at the hospital, he'd assumed the settlement had been depleted years ago. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see how you look at our apartment when you drop us off, the calculations you're making about our financial situation." Sarah's perception was as direct as her daughter's. "I want you to understand that our circumstances are a choice, not a necessity." Walter considered this. "And the foundation? What does it do?" "It funds research into childhood trauma recovery, psychological support for siblings who have lost brothers or sisters." Sarah's voice softened. "It's helped Emma being involved in something positive that honors Daniel's memory." Walter nodded slowly, a new understanding forming. "That's why you work such long hours. Not because you need to financially, but because helping others helps me," Sarah finished. "Yes." The parallel to Walter's own recent awakening wasn't lost on him. They had both sought redemption through different paths, his through isolation, hers through service, yet both had been running from the same pain. "I'd like to visit it," Walter said suddenly. "The foundation, if that would be appropriate." Something shifted in Sarah's expression, surprise, followed by cautious approval. "I think that could be arranged. It might be good for Emma to show you what we've built." "Thank you," Walter said simply. Sarah rose to leave, then paused. "There's something else. Dr. Abernathy mentioned you might be ready to try a few steps with the walker next week." "He thinks so," Walter confirmed. "I'm not as confident." "Emma is," Sarah said with a small smile. "She's already planning where your first real walk should be." "And where is that?" Sarah's smile faded slightly. "To Daniel's memorial bench in the park near our apartment." The suggestion hit Walter like a physical blow. He hadn't anticipated this, though perhaps he should have. Of course, Emma would want to connect his recovery to her brother's memory. Would that be too difficult for you?" Walter asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. It would be difficult, yes, but important for all of us. She met his eyes directly. Especially for you, Walter. After she left, Walter sat motionless at his desk, the significance of what Sarah had proposed settling over him. To walk to Daniel's memorial would be to directly confront what he had spent 10 years avoiding. It would mean acknowledging not just the accident itself, but the boy who had been lost, a real child with a name, a family, a sister who somehow found the strength to help her brother's killer walk again. The thought was terrifying. Yet Walter recognized that this, perhaps even more than standing or walking, was the true test of his recovery. The following Thursday brought steel-grey skies and a biting November wind. Walter sat in his study, watching leaves swirl across the lawn, a strange nervousness building in his chest. Today was the day Dr. Abernathy had scheduled for his first attempt at walking with the walker. The doorbell rang precisely at 4. Walter remained in his study, listening to Helen's footsteps in the hallway, the murmur of voices as she greeted Sarah and Emma. He heard Emma's quick steps approaching his study, her excitement evident in her pace. "Walter!" She burst into the room, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Dr. Abernathy is already in the gym setting up. Are you ready?" Walter managed to smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." Emma studied his face with that disconcerting perceptiveness. "You're nervous. Terrified, actually. Why, you've been doing so well." Walter considered how to explain the complexity of his emotions to an 11-year-old. "It's not just about whether I can physically do it. It's about deserving to." Emma's expression softened with understanding beyond her years. "Is this about Daniel?" Walter nodded, once again struck by her directness. "Yes." Emma approached his desk, her small face solemn. "Can I tell you something about him? Something Mom might not have mentioned?" "Of course." He forgave people. All the time. Emma's eyes held Walter's steadily. "When kids at school were mean to me, Daniel always said everyone deserves a second chance. He believed that." Walter felt his throat tighten. This small glimpse of the boy whose life he'd taken was both painful and precious, a gift he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you for telling me that," he said softly. Emma nodded. "So now you have to try. For him." The simplicity of her logic was irrefutable. Walter wheeled himself from behind the desk. "Then let's not keep Dr. Abernathy waiting." The gym had been transformed over the weeks. What had once been a sterile space filled with unused equipment was now a rehabilitation center, with parallel bars, balance tools, and the specialized walker Dr. Abernathy had brought for today's session. Sarah and the doctor were reviewing notes when Walter and Emma entered. They looked up, and Walter saw the careful optimism in both their expressions. "Ready for the big day?" Dr. Abernathy asked, his professional demeanor softened by genuine enthusiasm. Walter positioned his wheelchair near the walker. "Let's find out." The process was methodical. First, the now familiar standing exercises, with Emma's hands supporting Walter's as he rose from the chair. Then balance work, holding position while Dr. Abernathy checked his form and stability. "Excellent," the doctor commented. "You've built significant strength in your core, which is crucial for this next step. Now I'm going to position the walker in front of you, and I'll be right beside you. Sarah will spot you from the other side." Walter nodded, concentrating on maintaining his standing position. His legs trembled with the effort, but he remained upright, one hand still clasped in Emma's. "Emma, you should step back now," Dr. Abernathy suggested gently. "No," Walter said quickly. "I need her help." The doctor looked skeptical but deferred to Walter's request. "Very well, Emma. Stand directly in front of Mr. Donovan, just beyond the walker." Emma moved into position, her face a mixture of concentration and faith. Walter focused on her eyes, those steady, certain eyes that had somehow seen possibility where medicine saw only permanence. "Whenever you're ready," Dr. Abernathy said. "Remember, just one step. Don't overexert yourself." Walter gripped the handles of the walker, feeling their solid support. He shifted his weight slightly forward, the way they'd practiced in previous sessions. "You can do this," Emma said softly. Walter lifted his right foot, a fraction of an inch at first, then higher. With immense concentration, he moved it forward and set it down. His leg quivered with the effort, but held. "Excellent," Dr. Abernathy exclaimed. "Now shift your weight forward slightly." Walter obeyed, transferring his weight to his right leg. For a moment, he thought it would buckle, but the muscles held. Encouraged, he lifted his left foot and brought it forward to meet the right. One step. After 10 years of immobility, Walter Donovan had taken one step. Emma's face bloomed with joy. "You did it." Walter hardly heard her. He was focused entirely on the sensation, the pressure on his feet, the strain in his legs, the feeling of having moved through space under his own power. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, terrifying. "Should we try one more?" Dr. Abernathy asked. Walter nodded, already lifting his right foot again. The second step came easier than the first, his body remembering long dormant patterns of movement. Then a third step, bringing him directly in front of Emma. She reached out, taking his hands from the walker. For a moment, they stood face to face, connected by touch and something deeper, a bond formed through impossibility and forgiveness. "That's enough for today," Sarah said gently, noting Walter's exhaustion. Walter nodded, allowing Dr. Abernathy to help him back to his wheelchair. As he sank into the seat, he felt not defeat but triumph. 3 steps, a beginning. "Next week," Emma said with certainty, "you'll walk to the end of the gym and back." Walter smiled at her confidence. "One step at a time, Emma." Later, after Sarah and Emma had gone home and Dr. Abernathy had left with pages of notes, Walter sat alone in his study. The physical exertion had left him drained, but his mind was more alert than it had been in years. On impulse, he opened his laptop and navigated to the website of the Daniel Gray Foundation. The site was simple but effective, a clean design, showcasing programs for sibling grief support, trauma counseling, and community education. On the About page, Walter found himself looking at a photograph of Daniel Gray. The boy smiled broadly at the camera, his arm around a much younger Emma. They had the same eyes, observant, intelligent, kind. For 10 years, Walter had avoided this moment, confronting the reality of the life he had taken. He had made the boy an abstraction, a faceless tragedy, because the alternative was too painful to bear. Now, looking at Daniel's smiling face, Walter felt the full weight of what had been lost. Not just a life, but this specific life, a boy, who forgave easily, who protected his sister, who might have grown into an extraordinary man. The grief was crushing, yet alongside it grew something Walter hadn't expected. Gratitude. Gratitude for Emma's inexplicable gift. Gratitude for Sarah's courage in allowing her daughter to help the man responsible for her son's absence. Gratitude for the chance to make the remainder of his life matter in ways that might honor the boy in the photograph. Walter reached out, touching the screen gently, as if he could somehow reach across the divide between life and absence. "Thank you," he whispered to the smiling boy. "And I'm sorry, so very sorry. It wasn't enough. Nothing would ever be enough. But it was a beginning." Like the 3 steps he had taken today, it was a movement forward after years of stasis. As Walter closed the laptop, he felt something shift inside him. A weight not lifting exactly, but transforming. The burden of guilt would always be with him, but perhaps it could become something else, a foundation for purpose, for meaning, for service. Tomorrow, he would take another step, and another, until one day he might walk to Daniel's memorial bench and stand before it on his own 2 feet, not as a man seeking absolution, but as one offering continued remembrance and a promise to live differently because of a boy he had never known, and a girl who refused to hate. The Weight of Silence. Chapter 6. Walking into Light. Spring arrived in Windcrest with an explosion of color and light. Cherry blossoms lined the streets, daffodils pushed through the softening earth, and sunlight stretched longer into the evening hours. For Walter, The changing season marked not just nature's renewal, but his own remarkable transformation. 5 months had passed since that first tentative step in his home gym. 5 months of grueling physical therapy, of muscles relearning their purpose, of a body awakening from a decade-long slumber. The progress had been neither linear nor easy. There were days of advancement followed by days of setbacks, moments of triumph overshadowed by frustration and pain. Through it all, Emma remained his constant, her unwavering belief more powerful than any medical intervention. 3 times weekly, she and Sarah came to the mansion, their visits evolving from formal therapy sessions to something more resembling family gatherings. They shared meals, watched movies, celebrated holidays together. Walter had even attended Emma's school science fair, sitting proudly in the audience as she explained her project on electromagnetic energy. Dr. Abernathy continued to document Walter's recovery, though he had long since abandoned scientific explanations for what was happening. Some things, he'd said during their last session, medicine simply isn't equipped to understand yet. By April, Walter had progressed from the walker to forearm crutches. His steps were slow and deliberate, but unmistakably his own. He could now walk the length of his garden and back, navigate the main floor of his mansion without resting, even stand for brief conversations at social events. This last development had surprised everyone, including Walter himself. After years of isolation, he had gradually begun re-engaging with the community. It started small, attending a Donovan Foundation board meeting in person rather than via video conference, accepting an invitation to the hospital charity gala, where Sarah was being honored for her work. Each public appearance generated whispers of amazement. The reclusive Walter Donovan, walking again after a decade in a wheelchair. Medical miracle, some called it. Divine intervention, suggested others. Walter offered no explanations, deflecting questions with practiced ease. The truth of his recovery remained private, shared only among those who had facilitated it. On a perfect spring morning, Walter stood at his bedroom window, watching gardeners prepare flower beds for new plantings. The walking canes Dr. Abernathy had recently prescribed leaned against the wall nearby, elegant mahogany with silver handles, custom-made to replace the clinical metal crutches. Today was the day. After months of preparation, Walter would finally fulfill the promise he'd made to Emma and Sarah, to walk to Daniel's memorial bench. The date had been carefully chosen. April 17th, what would have been Daniel's 16th birthday. Walter, dressed with care, selecting a lightweight suit in navy blue, comfortable shoes specially designed for his still uncertain gait. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he barely recognized the man reflected there. The haunted pallor had given way to healthy color. The grim set of his mouth softened into something approaching peace. Even his silver hair seemed different, less a mark of premature aging and more a distinguished crown. The doorbell rang precisely at 10. Walter took his canes and made his way carefully down the stairs, a feat that still filled him with quiet wonder each time he accomplished it. Sarah and Emma waited in the foyer. They too had dressed for the occasion, Sarah in a simple blue dress, Emma in a yellow sundress that brightened the solemn moment. "Good morning," Walter greeted them, his voice steady despite the emotion of the day ahead. Emma approached, examining him with the seriousness that remained her hallmark, despite the gradual lightening of her spirit over the months of their acquaintance. "You look ready," she said simply. Walter nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Sarah's gaze was compassionate. She understood, perhaps better than Emma, the emotional weight of what they were about to do. "We can still postpone if you need more time," she offered quietly. Walter shook his head. "No, today is right for Daniel." They took Walter's car, driven by James, his rarely used chauffeur. The drive to the other side of Windcrest took only 15 minutes, but it represented a journey across worlds. From Walter's mansion on Hillcrest Avenue to the modest neighborhood where Sarah and Emma made their home. The park was small but well-maintained, with winding paths and carefully tended gardens. James parked at the entrance where a simple sign read, "Windcrest Community Garden." "The bench is near the center," Sarah explained as Walter carefully exited the car, About 300 yards from here. Walter assessed the distance. It was farther than he had walked continuously since beginning his recovery, but not impossible. He adjusted his grip on the canes, determination setting his jaw. Lead the way. They moved slowly along the paved path, Walter between Sarah and Emma, his canes tapping a steady rhythm on the concrete. The morning was perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the scent of new growth permeating the air. Other visitors to the park stared curiously at the trio, the elegant older man with his canes, flanked by the woman and child who matched their pace to his. Walter hardly noticed their attention. His focus had narrowed to the path ahead and the increasingly difficult task of placing one foot before the other. By the halfway point, sweat beaded on his forehead. His legs, still rebuilding their strength after years of atrophy, began to tremble with the exertion. Sarah noticed immediately. "We should rest a moment," she suggested, indicating a nearby bench. Walter shook his head. "Not yet." Emma slipped her hand into his free one, the touch familiar and strengthening. "It's just around that corner," she encouraged. Walter nodded, drawing a deep breath before continuing. Forward. The path curved around a flowering dogwood tree, revealing a small circular garden. In its center stood a simple stone bench, bathed in dappled sunlight. Walter stopped, momentarily overcome. This was it, the memorial to the child whose life had ended because of his carelessness. The physical destination of today's journey, and the emotional one he had been traveling for months. "We had it placed here because Daniel loved this spot," Sarah explained softly. "He used to climb that oak tree, the big one behind the bench." Walter nodded, unable to speak. With Emma's hand still in his, he moved forward again, each step heavier than the last. When they reached the bench, he saw the simple bronze plaque affixed to the stone. Daniel Thomas Gray, 2009-2015. His light continues to shine. Beneath the words was a small engraving of a child reading under a tree. The simplicity of it, the ordinariness, struck Walter deeply. Not a grand monument, but a quiet place of remembrance, just as Daniel had been not an abstract tragedy, but a real boy who had read books under trees. Walter's legs finally gave way, and he sank onto the bench, his canes clattering to the ground. Emma quickly retrieved them, leaning them against the stone, then sat beside him. Sarah remained standing, her hand resting lightly on the plaque, a habitual gesture of connection. For several minutes, they sat in silence. Birds called from the nearby trees, and somewhere distant children laughed on a playground. Life continuing as it always did, even in spaces marked by loss. "I've imagined this moment for months," Walter finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "What I would say, how I would feel, but now that I'm here—" "You don't need to say anything," Sarah assured him. But Walter shook his head. "I do. Not for you, or even for Daniel, but for myself." He straightened, gathering his strength. "I never allowed myself to truly face what happened. I paid the settlement, I endured the physical consequences, but I hid from the human reality of it. From Daniel as a person, not just an accident." Emma leaned slightly against Walter's side, a silent support. He continued, the words coming easier now. "These past months have been about more than learning to walk again. They've been about learning to live again, with purpose, with meaning, with the full weight of responsibility, not just guilt." Sarah sat on Walter's other side, completing their circle. "Daniel would have liked the foundation projects you've initiated, especially the accessible playgrounds." Walter nodded. After learning about the Daniel Gray Foundation, he had redirected much of the Donovan Foundation's resources to complement and expand its work. The partnership had already resulted in 3 new accessible playgrounds in underserved neighborhoods, a pediatric trauma center at Windcrest Memorial, and a scholarship program for siblings of accident victims. "It's not atonement," Walter said, carefully. "I know nothing can be that, but perhaps it's continuation, a way for Daniel's spirit to influence the world, even now." That's what Mum always says, Emma interjected, that when someone leaves, they don't really go away. They just change how they're here. Walter looked at this extraordinary child, who had somehow bridged worlds, between injury and healing, between grief and purpose, between past and future. Your mother is very wise. Sarah smiled, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Not wise, just experienced in finding ways forward when the path seems impossible. They sat together as the morning deepened toward noon, sharing quiet stories of Daniel, his love of climbing trees, his talent for making friends, the time he'd rescued a baby bird and nursed it back to health. With each anecdote, the boy became more real to Walter, more fully dimensional. No longer just the child from the accident, but Daniel Gray, brave, kind, mischievous, loved. Eventually, Walter reached for his canes. "I'd like to try something if you'll help me." Sarah and Emma stood, understanding his intention without explanation. With their support, Walter rose from the bench. Then, carefully, he handed his canes to Sarah. "Emma," he said softly, "would you—" She stepped in front of him, extending her hands as she had that first morning on the dock. Walter took them, feeling the now familiar warmth flow between them. "Close your eyes and remember," Emma instructed, her ritual unchanged after all these months. Walter obeyed, concentrating on the connection between them, the mysterious current that had somehow reawakened his dormant nerves. He felt the strength flow through him, not just physical strength, but something deeper, a convergence of purpose and possibility. Slowly, Walter released Emma's right hand, maintaining his grip. On her left, he opened his eyes, finding his balance in this new unsupported posture. "I think," he said carefully, "I can take a few steps on my own." Sarah watched with a mixture of professional assessment and personal investment. "Are you sure?" Walter nodded. "I need to do this. Here." Emma squeezed his hand once, then gently released it, stepping back. Walter stood alone before Daniel's bench, swaying slightly but remaining upright through sheer determination. He took a deep breath, then lifted his right foot. The movement was small, but controlled as he placed it forward. Then the left foot, completing one unassisted step, then another, and another. Walter Donovan walked 4 steps entirely on his own before reaching for Emma's outstretched hand. It was a modest distance by any standard, but the significance was immeasurable. He had walked, unsupported, at the memorial of the child whose loss had defined the last decade of his life. "He sees you," Emma said quietly. "I know he does." Walter didn't question her certainty. After all they had experienced together, he had learned that some truths existed beyond rational explanation. "I hope so," he replied. "I hope he knows how much you both have given me, not just the ability to walk, but the reason to." Sarah retrieved his canes and handed them to him with gentle dignity. "This is just the beginning, Walter, for all of us." As they walked slowly back toward the park entrance, Walter felt lighter than he had in years. The burden he carried hadn't disappeared. He would always bear responsibility for what had happened, but it had transformed into something that propelled him forward rather than holding him in place. The months ahead held challenges, he knew. His recovery would continue to require dedication and work. The partnership between the foundations would face logistical hurdles. His re-emergence into public life would bring scrutiny and questions. Yet for the first time in a decade, Walter looked toward the future with something approaching peace. Whatever came next, he would face it standing. Sometimes with canes, sometimes with helping hands, but always with the knowledge that even the most devastating moments could lead to unexpected redemption. As they reached the car, Emma turned to Walter with her characteristic directness. "Sunday dinner at our place this week?" she asked. "I'm making lasagna." Walter smiled at this evidence of their evolving relationship, how they had moved from formal rehabilitation sessions to shared meals, from strangers connected by tragedy to something resembling family. "I wouldn't miss it," he replied. Sarah opened the car door, but before Walter could enter, she placed a hand on his arm. "Daniel used to say something whenever one of his friends was sad," she said softly. "He'd tell them, 'Take my hand and walk with me. Everything's better when you're not alone.'" Walter felt the words resonate through him, so similar to Emma's first invitation on the dock, as if the brother had somehow spoken through the sister across the divide of years. Wise beyond his years, Walter said, his voice thick with emotion. Like his sister, Sarah agreed. As the car pulled away from the park, Walter watched the green space recede through the window. The bench was no longer visible, but he carried its image with him, not as a monument to loss, but as a marker of connection. A place where the past and present had finally reconciled, where guilt had begun its long transformation into purpose. Emma's hand slipped into his, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Walter squeezed it gently, grateful beyond words for this child who had appeared like an angel on a misty morning and led him back into light. "What's next?" Emma asked, her face bright with the certainty that there would always be a next step. A new goal, a forward path. Walter considered the question, feeling the steady strength in his legs, the clarity in his mind, the unfamiliar but welcome warmth in his heart. "Life," he answered simply. "Real life, at last." And as the car carried them through the spring-bright streets of Windcrest, Walter Donovan understood that his true healing had never been about walking again. It had been about learning to reach out, to connect, to forgive, both others and himself. It had been about discovering that sometimes the heaviest burdens could only be lifted with help, and that the most profound journeys began with the simplest invitation. Take my hand and walk with me. Dear listeners, we hope Walter and Emma's journey has touched your heart as deeply as it has touched ours. This story of healing, forgiveness, and second chances reminds us that even in our darkest moments, connection can light the way forward. We've prepared a special playlist of equally moving stories that explore the complexity of human relationships and the power of unexpected bonds. You'll find it by clicking the link on your left. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that illuminate the depths of the human experience. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have so many more stories waiting to be told. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Has someone in your life helped you walk through a difficult time? Share your experience with our community of listeners who understand the power of healing. Connections. Until our next journey together, remember that sometimes the most profound healing begins with a simple extended hand.